am glad to be with you today. If you came today expecting Pastor Lowell, I am sorry to inform you that he was out visiting family this past week, and it became apparent yesterday and then confirmed this morning that he's most likely has some bronchitis, and he was feeling pretty rough this morning. He was on the fence about whether he thought he was physically going to be able to be here, and as the morning progressed, it became apparent that he probably needed to seek some urgent care and maybe get some antibiotics and stuff like that. So he's pretty sick. He's in good spirits. He was definitely struggling with not being here today. He wanted to be here. He missed you guys last week, but as it turned out, he is going to stay home, rest, and try to recover. So we've been in this series on relationships. We're going to kind of deviate from that series. He was prepared today to talk a little bit about that. So we're going to kind of do a one-off. I'm just going to share with you some thoughts on some leadership and some spiritual ideas that the Lord had stirred in myself and some others a while back. This is actually based on a four-part curriculum that Megan and I wrote last year for a youth retreat. And so I think it's beneficial for us to maybe hear it. I hope it encourages us today. So if you will just extend us some grace this morning, we're going to just have what the Lord has for us today, and we'll be back on schedule next week with relationships. So most of you know I'm Lenny. I'm the family pastor here at Crossroads, but in addition to being the family pastor, myself and Bobby years ago started an organization called Capstone Climbing and Adventure, and we do a lot of outdoor adventure programming, but one of the things that we do is we do team enrichment, leadership development kind of thing with corporate groups. This past Friday, I had an opportunity to work with our local chamber. Some of their ambassadors were here. We did some team building and some encouragement there for one of their workshops. And oftentimes when we do team building, one of the taglines that we kind of use is this phrase called putting aces in their places. This idea was shared with me about a decade or so ago. A mentor of mine, we were kind of talking about, we were using this analogy about having the right people on the bus and in the right seats and things like that. And I was reminded, or they were reminding me that the best hand in poker is actually 4 aces. Like that's the best hand that you could have in poker. But when it comes to teams, when it comes to life, it's not just enough to have all aces, but it's also about where those aces are at on the team. It's about putting aces in their places. And really, really easy example for you guys to understand is the way that we structure staff here. Most of you have had the unfortunate pleasure of hearing me sing. You got to hear me sing one of the songs that we did at Easter, and so you know that I am a terrible, terrible singer. And it's okay to say amen to that. I understand that I'm not a good singer, and I've just accepted that I'm not a good singer. But fortunately, people like Jennifer and Lee and others are extremely gifted in that. And so thankfully, those aces are in the right places, and Bobby and I are not up here today leading worship. Okay, so you kind of see what I'm talking about. But it's great to have aces, but you need to have aces in the right places. And so it's about kind of putting everybody where they need to be so that they're walking in the fullness of their gifts and their strengths and things like that they complement and encourage one another. And that's not a hard concept for us to understand. And so when we're doing team building, that's one of the things that we try to challenge them with. Now, I like that phrase, aces in their places, because, as would have it, most coaches, any of you ever played sports in like middle school, high school and stuff like that, maybe even college or whatever. So I grew up, my dad was a coach. And so one of the things that, from doing sports and from living with a dad who was a coach, I know that coaches always have like these cool catchphrases and these cool lines that they use to help inspire and encourage their athletes to be the best that they can be. And the truth is that most of us in this room played some type of sports, either in middle school, high school. Some of us were fortunate enough to go on to play in college. But there's very few people in this room who actually turned those sports into a full-time career or profession. The reality is that most of us and most of our kids, when we play sports, when they graduate school, that'll kind of be the end of their sports career. My wife and I, when our kids were a little bit younger and we started talking about what sports we wanted them to play, I always said I wanted my kids to participate in some kind of sport that would at least benefit them later on in life, right? Like I wanted my daughters to do dance because, as opposed to another sport, because I'm going, if they do dance, they're probably not going to become professional dancers, but at least they'll know how to dance later on in life, right? They'll be able to use some of those, when they go to weddings, or they'll just feel comfortable. They'll just feel comfortable dancing. And so oftentimes we encourage our kids to participate in sports in the hopes that they'll become professional athletes or maybe get college scholarships. But more importantly, it helps us develop skills that we need for the rest of our lives. One of the biggest benefits for playing sports is things like teamwork, understanding what it means to win and lose, understanding what it means to do hard work and things like that. So there's a lot of benefits in participating in sports. And oftentimes the men and women who are coaches are experienced enough that they don't just coach these kids in the sport, but they're also behind the scenes coaching them in life, right? They're trying to encourage them and inspire them and develop them to be productive, effective, strong men and women. So coaches are always using these kind of taglines and things like that, like aces in their places. About a year ago, I was at a luncheon that one of our ministries, our Seekers ministry, was hosting for a young man who's going to be going off to school. And one of the things that we did was we asked the young man to kind of step into the middle of the room. And those of us that had been involved in his life for a while went around the room and tried to offer words of encouragement or words of inspiration and speak life over him before he left. And one of the individuals there was Christina McAteer's dad, Bill. And Bill's a retired Army colonel, but he's in his retirement years, he spends most of his time, or a lot of his time, coaching youth baseball. And he's got that typical coach personality and mentality. And so it comes time for Bill to share with this young man, and he says, "Hey, I want to share this acronym with you, ACEs, and I want to kind of share 4 things." And I said, I want to encourage you with 4 different things, and they're easy to remember because we're going to use the acronym ACEs. And as he began to share these things, I thought about how fitting it was with that whole ACEs in their places and that acronym. And so I want to share with us the 4 things, because as soon as he got done, I looked at Bill and I said, "Man, that'll preach." Like, I know that you use that primarily as a sports analogy, but man, that would absolutely preach. And so I came back and I kind of wrote the 4 things down, and the acronym to use, ACEs, was for attitude, commitment, enthusiasm, and service. And I'm going to unpack those in a minute. But Megan and I sat down and we kind of took each one of those and defined them and began to look through biblical stories that lined up with that. And we came up with this little 4-page devotional that we used on these youth retreats. Now, keep in mind, I only had a couple of hours to prepare today, so I tried to take a weekend-long devotional, 4 booklets, and condense it into a 47-minute talk. So you're going to be late for lunch, but we'll get through it. And no, I'm going to try to get this done in about 20, 25 minutes, all right? So I'm going to try to cover four things that I want us to talk about. We're going to use the word acronym. It's about putting aces in their places, and what does it mean to be an ace, all right? So we're going to start with A. A stands for attitude. Attitude is defined as the settled way of thinking or feeling about someone or something. Typically one that is reflected in a person's behavior or beliefs. Our attitude. I think it's significant that A and attitude start, because I think what you're going to find is these other 3 flow out of the posture of our attitude. After the first service, I was talking to a gentleman who's a pilot, and he was giving me another example about, I love when people share stories like this that you can use. And he's talking about how attitude, when it's flying, your attitude is basically your pitch up and down. I'm not a pilot, so if I butcher this, forgive me. But it's your pitch up and down. When you've got a positive attitude, you're going up. When you have a negative attitude, you're going down. And it's all about the attitude of the plane, right? And so our attitude matters, and it will help shape the other three things. In fact, again, attitude is a settled way of thinking or feeling about something or someone, typically when it reflects our behavior or our beliefs. Lee didn't know that I was going to be using David as an example, but he brought him up earlier when he was leading worship. And I want to take a quick look at just a short story that you and I are most likely familiar with as it pertains to King David. In 1 Samuel 17, David is a young boy. He's a teenage boy. His primary responsibility right now is to work for his father, guarding the flock. His brothers who are older are part of the army of Israel, and they are off on the battlefield fighting the Philistines. And right now, there's this standoff between the Philistines and the Israelites. And the Philistines have this enormous giant of a man called Goliath. And these two armies have faced off against each other, and Goliath has walked out onto the battlefield, and day after day after day, he has taunted the Israelites. He has mocked them. He has made fun of them. He has mocked their God. He has made fun of their God. And he has challenged, if there's anyone among them that's brave enough to walk out on the battlefield and challenge him, that if they can defeat him, then they'll surrender to them. But if they lose, then they have to surrender to them. So David is asked by his father to kind of take some food to his brothers and kind of check on how things are going and give him a report back. So David travels up to where the army is, and he happens to be there at a time of day in which Goliath walks out and begins to mock God and mock the army. So David, asking of the people around, David asked in verse 26, David asked the men standing near him, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the army of God? So right off the bat, David is listening to this guy mock his God, mock the army, and he's going, wait a minute, why are we just standing around taking this? I mean, what's going to be done about this? Who's going to take care of this? So David's like, I'm not going to stand for this. I'm not going to listen to him mock us and mock God. I'm going to go and say something. So he goes to the king. Now imagine you're the king of the army, and this little 13-year-old shepherd boy comes up to you and says, hey, why are we standing here listening to this? Why are we putting up with this? In verse 32, David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. David's attitude was, I'm not going to stand by and listen to this. He's not going to mock God. He's not going to mock what I know to be true. He's not going to mock what I know to be the most powerful army. I'll go and fight him. And Saul, doing what any great leader would do, would look at this 13-year-old boy and go, wait a minute, how in the world are you going to possibly go up against? Like, even my best warriors won't walk out on the battlefield. And David says to Saul, your servant has been keeping your father's sheep. When a lion or bear came to carry off the sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the army of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the Philistine. In other words, hold my beer. What an amazing attitude, right? I mean, you've got the king questioning his ability, and David's going, look, don't dismiss me as a kid. I've fought lions, I've fought bears, I've killed all of them. Going out here and fighting this guy's going to be nothing. David walks out on the battlefield to face Goliath, and he says to him, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the army of Israel, who you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I will strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you unto our hands." What is our attitude when it comes to our faith? Is our attitude one of soaring, or is our attitude one of headed towards crashing and burning? Is our attitude one of belief and one of hope, or is our attitude one of discouragement and despair? What is our attitude in our families? What is our attitude towards our spouse, towards our kids? What about where we work? What about the work that God has given us to provide for our families? What is our attitude? I'm not discounting that walking this faith journey isn't difficult. I'm not discounting that our families aren't difficult. I'm not discounting that the work that we have isn't difficult. But what's our attitude when we approach? Do we approach with the blessed assurance that God is on our side? Next is commitment. The state or quality of being dedicated to a cause, an activity, etc. Commitment. What is our commitment? The passage I want to take a look at there, I think most deserving, is one written by Paul in 2 Corinthians. As most of you know, if you've been part of our discipleship night on Wednesday, we've been studying through the book of Acts, and a lot of that is looking at the early church, and a lot of it's looking at Paul and his ministry and the mission of the men and the women that started the early church and endured persecution and hardship on a level that we've never known. And Paul spends a lot of his time, particularly in prison, writing letters to encourage the church, to remind them of God's commitment and faithfulness, and encouraging them to stay committed and stay faithful. And in 2 Corinthians, he deviates from some of his usual writing, and it's one of the few times in which Paul actually boasts of his qualifications. He spent much of his time trying not to boast. But the church had surrendered itself to a lot of false teaching. It had surrendered itself to a lot of flowery teaching. See, what had happened is there were a group of speakers who would come around, and they were well-polished speakers. They were professional speakers. In our time, let's put it in a little modern time, they had written numerous books, and they had been asked to speak in large venues, and they had spoke to hundreds and thousands and maybe tens of thousands, and they knew exactly how to tailor their message to their audience and boast of their credentials and make sure that their messages speak to the culture and the way that the culture wants to hear it, and particularly maybe not say things that are offensive or difficult or whatever, but things that are very flowery and things that tickle your ear and make you want to hear it, and they boast of their credentials to justify their position, and the people just love it. And Paul says, okay, if we really want to talk about what commitment looks like, I'll give you my resume. He said, they say that they're Hebrews. Okay, so am I. I'm in 2 Corinthians 11 if you want to look it up. They say they're Hebrews. Okay, so am I. They say they're Israelites. Again, so am I. Are they Abraham's descendants? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I must be out of my mind to talk like this, but I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent nights and days in open seas. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from my Gentiles, in danger from the city, in danger from the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I have faced daily the pressure of my concern for the church. Most of us in this room have never truly been hungry. Most of us in this room have never been beaten. Most of us in this room have never been shipwrecked or lost at sea. Most of us have never been truly persecuted. But I'm concerned that most of us have never been concerned for the church either. Most of us, our commitment is challenged when the neighbor down the street simply looks weird at us because we go to church on Sundays. Most of us, our commitment is challenged when we're forced to stand firm on the truth of what God's word says when everything in the culture around us tells us that's wrong. What is your commitment, first and foremost, to your faith? Are you committed to the things that Paul said? What about your commitment to your family? Are you committed not just to be faithful physically to your spouse, but are you committed to truly, truly love them and to be patient and understanding and long-suffering? What about, are you committed to the work that God has given you? Or do you just simply see it as a means to an end? Next is enthusiasm. Enthusiasm. Intense or eager enjoyment, interest, or approval. For this example, I chose to go back to 1 Samuel, but I'm going to back up to chapter 14. Again, the children of Israel, this is prior to the David and Goliath, but they're going to fight the Philistines, okay? But let me, I promise you can read it. It's in the Bible. I'm not making this up, but I'd be willing to bet a few of you, because a couple of people in first service kind of started thinking through this and went, that sounds eerily similar to maybe some situations we find ourselves in today. Okay, let me set the scene. The children of Israel have become so friendly with the enemies around them that they are dependent on their enemies for most of the goods and services that they have. Okay? To the point that they have run out of weapons. In their entire army, they have 2 swords. They have literally had to take farm tools and give them to the Philistine blacksmiths so that the Philistine blacksmiths can make weapons to give back to them so that they can fight the Philistines. And in giving their farm tools to the Philistines to make weapons, they have now reduced their ability to farm, so they need the Philistines to provide them food because they don't have the weapon, they don't have the tools to make their own food because they've given the tools to the Philistines so that the Philistines can make weapons for them to go and fight the Philistines. It's almost as if they were a modern country who has become too dependent on foreign countries to develop goods and resources that they have weakened their own defenses and their own ability to provide. Just saying. So Jonathan, who is the son of Saul, knows that they need to go and fight the Philistines. Saul can look at the scenario around him and go, we might be in trouble. So he goes, I'm going to go take a nap under a pomegranate tree. And I'm going to pray and make sure that the Lord wants us to do this. I'm glad that we don't have political leaders who would go and take naps instead of doing, I'm just throwing it out there, okay? Rather than doing the hard work. I'm not saying all of our leaders are like that, but I'm just saying. Some may be asleep at the wheel. But Jonathan's not. Jonathan's the son of the king. He's a warrior. So he looks at his armor bearer. Now, this is probably a teenager, probably not fit or qualified to be a warrior. This guy's sole purpose is just to simply carry around the armor for Jonathan. And he looks at his armor bearer and he says, hey, I got this great idea. Okay? He says, come, let us go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men, and perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few. His armor bearer responds, do all that you have in mind. Go ahead. I am with you, heart and soul. My wife is a teacher, so I'm just going to preface it by saying I could say this about many professions. The last thing I happened to see on Facebook this morning was a post by a teacher, okay? In case most of you didn't know, if you've got kids, the end of school's coming up, and this makes teachers kind of happy. All right, and many of them have started posting pictures of like people doing crazy dances and say teachers on the last day of school and this, that, and the other, because it's been a tough year. And teachers are tired and they're burned out. Our students are tired and they're burned out. But I want to break some bad news to you, okay? I know you're enthusiastic about the end of the year, but August will be here before you know it. And the reason I say that is because you could plug that same, just pick your profession, pick your situation, all right? Life is a series of mountaintops and valleys, mountaintops and valleys. If you're waiting for the end of that quarter, if you're waiting for, the next school year, if you're waiting for the next promotion, if you're waiting for, next year when my kids can drive, or next year when they're not doing this sport, or next season when we get in this, next week when my wife and I have more time to, whatever that is, there'll always be a next week. There'll always be, those type of things are going to get moved further and further out because life is difficult. And I'm not saying that we don't need a break. I'm not saying we don't need a breather, but our attitude determines our commitment. And our commitment inspires. It inspires us to stay true and to be enthusiastic. I get that it's difficult. But when it comes to our faith, when it comes to our families, and when it comes to the work of our hands, we've got to find that enthusiasm. Remember when you were first a Christian, when you first became a Christian, and you couldn't read enough, you couldn't do enough devotions, you couldn't pray enough, you couldn't come to church enough, you couldn't sit in enough worship services or enough Bible studies, and then the reality of how difficult it can be to walk this faith out starts to weigh in on you, and you become tired and you become exhausted. And I want us to find that enthusiasm again. The fourth thing is service. The action of helping or doing work for someone else. Jesus didn't come to be served, but to serve. The best example of service I could find was in John 13. Many of you know this story. It's the Passover feast. Jesus is about to be betrayed. He's going to be taken prisoner. He's going to be crucified. And then Jesus does something that would have been completely surprising to anybody following a rabbi. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to be with the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and he had come from God, and it was time to return to God. He got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them off with a towel that he had wrapped around him. When he came to Simon, who was with him, who said to him, "Lord, you're not going to wash my feet." Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you'll understand." "No," Peter said, "you shall never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part of me." Then Lord Simon replied, "Don't just wash my feet, wash all of me. Wash my hands, my head, everything." Jesus answered, "Those who have already had a bath only need to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. You are clean, though not every one of you." He knew who was going to betray him. And that's why he said, not everyone is clean. When he'd finished washing their feet, he put his clothes back on and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I've done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is the messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them." See, our attitude defines and positions our commitment. Our commitment inspires our enthusiasm. And our enthusiasm drives us to serve as Jesus served. Service to our faith. Service to our families. Service to our work. As the band comes up, I want to close with some final thoughts. I love the acronym that Bill gave me that day. It fits so well into this thought of aces in their places. We were talking earlier today about just this past primary election and how many of the men and women that were put in places of influence are like-minded to many of us in this room. I believe God is still putting aces in all the right places. I believe He's still putting men and women who have the right attitudes, who are committed to the cause, who are committed to walking in the truth of the gospel, who are enthusiastic about the opportunities they've been given and are willing to serve a cause greater than themselves. There's not a lot of coaches left in life, but we sure need some. We need more victors, not more victims. We need more collaborators, not debaters. And we need more champions and celebrators, not haters. We need men and women who are true disciples and are willing to be followers of Jesus. Be blessed.